Good evening and welcome to the first session of our Spring Term Money webinar series by the Institute of International Monetary Research in collaboration with the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. I'm Juan Castaneda, Director of the IIMR, and today we'll be hosting Bill Robinson. Bill was an economic forecaster in the 1970s and 80s at 10 Downing Street, the Treasury, the European Commission, and the London Business School, where he was the editor of the LBS Economic Outlook and Exchange Rate Outlook. He subsequently became director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, wrote a regular column for the Independent newspaper, and was invited to become a special advisor on tax policy to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont at the time. After Black Wednesday, well, the Chancellor lost his job, and so did Bill, and he decided to enter the commercial world and became a director at London Economics, and subsequently director and head of the UK business economist at PwC. In 2007, he joined KPMG to found a new economics practice, which he grew to 60 economists and a turnover of £30 million. In 2015, he returned to macroeconomics at KPMG's chief economist, while remaining chairman of the economics practice. He ceased to be chief economist in 2016, but remains attached to KPMG as a senior advisor. Today, we'll discuss with Bill the current inflation episode in the UK, lessons from the 1970s, after which we will allow time for Q&A with viewers at home. Today's presentation will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. You can go to our website to access these and other webinars in our series. Questions must be submitted via the Q&A option, and I will moderate them and address the speaker at the end of the presentation. So, Bill, thank you very much for taking the time to give a seminar for us. We're looking forward to your presentation. This is indeed the topic nowadays. And again, the floor is entirely yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let me go straight to my first slide. And in the time of a principle, I wanted to start off by saying what I'm hoping to persuade you of in the course of the next 35 or 40 minutes. And point number one is that the surge in inflation, which everyone is talking about, supply side problems, oil, gas, Ukraine, and my story is that it really isn't. I mean, those things, of course, are true and important, but actually you can explain the surge in inflation without any of them. What went wrong is a policy error to do with COVID, which was to have an unfunded, very large unfunded public sector deficit. That error was not confined to the UK. Most Western economies made the same mistake, and particularly badly in the United States, which is always very important. Lessons from the 70s are that there was a very similar global policy error then, in which people overestimated the potential growth of output, and I'll be showing the evidence for that. They made the same mistake and they had very big inflation. And the question really I end with is, how big is it going to be? And I would say it's not as bad as the 70s, but it's still pretty bad. So that's the story I'm hoping to tell. And it starts obviously with a picture of inflation as measured by the CPI. The red line, bang up to date, is today's data. The data that was on the Today program this morning, yesterday's data for April. And you can see that it just creeps past January 1989, which means they are saying that this is the worst inflation for 42 years. All the news items are about, as I say, the things that are in the news. That's the nature of newspapers. They don't report things that happened 3 years ago. And we all know as economists that any inflation, any rise in prices, there's a demand side and there's a supply side. The common narrative, it's the supply side. My story is it's all about demand side, greatly underestimated, I think, by policymakers at the moment. It's worth talking for a moment about why we should really worry about inflation. I think people actually naturally worry at the moment because of the cost of living crisis, so-called. But I have a slightly different take on this. If you live with inflation, if you have 10% or 12% inflation, it really does distort price signals. You can't tell if the price is high or low because, you know, it might just be about to go up by 10% because that's what happens in inflationary times. So living with it is very, very bad, I think, for the supply side, for the rate of growth, for the efficient allocation of resources. So you have to eliminate it. And by and large, we as a country have always concluded that you have to eliminate it. We don't have Latin American inflation today, though we briefly did in the 70s. But here's where the chart is important. Eliminating it always takes a recession, or in the case of the Great Inflation, 2 recessions in 1975 and 1980. You can see the blue line on the chart. Again, we had the Lawson boom, terrible mistake, and that had to be eliminated by yet another recession. And then we had the boom leading up to the financial crisis, and that led to yet another recession. In each case, you'll see after the recession that the red line comes down. It's a reliable way of getting inflation down, but it is painful. And I fear this inflation is already bad enough that I'm convinced it will take another recession. Indeed, it will probably bring one on. Still on the big picture, I've produced 100 years or so of data here, again, inflation, and labeled the peaks. And you'll see it's mainly all about war. World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, the Gulf War, until we get to COVID-19, which was a global shock on the same scale, I think, as some of those events, and probably on the same scale as the Vietnam. That is why we have the problems we have today. And so there's a sense in which we shouldn't be entirely surprised. We have been here before multiple times. But the worst time is the Great Inflation, which I've highlighted in blue. And I say one of the questions I'm going to try to answer is how bad it is going to be. So let me start to talk about what Mervyn King, in his really excellent lecture given, sponsored by IIMR in November, which I attended and have since reread, he described as a monetary overhang. It's all about a monetary overhang. And I showed you the side of the wars because there are also lessons to be learnt, I think, in this episode from previous episodes caused by war. Actually, on the Today program this morning, they were discussing the aftermath of, sorry, not on the Today program, on the Long View, which just followed the Today program at 9 o'clock. They were discussing the 1920s, at the aftermath of the First World War. But I actually think there's more to be learnt from 1939, 1940, the inflation that happened at the outbreak of the Second World War, not least because the great economist John Maynard Keynes wrote one of his lesser-known books, How to Pay for the War, a sort of extended pamphlet, really, written to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And basically his story was, look, this is going to be bad. We've got all these people who we are taking out of producing consumable goods and putting them onto parade grounds to learn how to shoot and march and etc. And other people taken out of consumable goods making munitions. But we're paying these people. So there's the same demand, money demand, but fewer consumable goods. It's bound to lead to inflation. And his solution actually was to pay the soldiers in redeemable bonds, but that didn't find favor. Instead, we had rationing. But I think you'll have been swift to see the parallels that when COVID came along, we told people they had to stay at home. We were removing their livelihood in many cases, so we had to support them, and we did. So we paid the people to do, as it were, to make nothing, and created this excess demand. But those of you who look at the numbers will swiftly point out to me, but actually didn't inflation fall in 2020? And yes, it did. Very unlike 1939, 1940. Well, there was a very good reason for that, which is really central to the nature of this COVID-induced recession. What happened in 2020 when people were told to stay at home is that not only could they not produce, but they couldn't consume either. And yet they were being paid the furlough money. So it went into the bank, as it were. And that was, you can see what happened to the savings ratio, again, astronomical all-time high. And that's why there wasn't excess demand immediately in 2020. That's why inflation actually fell in 2020. But you can see that as the savings ratio came back down to more normal levels in 2021, we have started to see inflation happen. And this brings me to what I think is one of the most interesting aspects of this whole crisis, which is the very unusual nature of the COVID recession. I put it in inverted commas in the title to this slide, because for me, a recession is when people lose confidence and stop spending, and you get a recession, and supply is unchanged, demand falls, and you have a lot of spare capacity. And it's a very good idea in a recession of that sort to do something like fiscal expansion, quantitative easing, etc. Well, look at this chart. Look at the recession of 1975, of 1980, of 1991 to 3, of 2007 to 9. The output gap, as measured by the OBR, which is the gap between basically potential production and the actual production in the economy, the output gap in all those cases, there was a large negative output gap. Plenty of room, as it were, with a stimulus to get more output. And then look at COVID, hardly any. And this is why I put up the two quotes on the screen, which I can't actually read because my own face is in front of them. But it says, basically, the OBR said there is only a small margin of spare capacity, and the recession should be thought of as a simultaneous fall in supply, basically in production and consumption. And Mervyn King, who showed a very similar chart to this in his lecture, said it's not far from clear that any additional stimulus was required. And why is that? Because when you let people out, when the lockdown is lifted, that is its own stimulus. They can then go to the pub, to the football game, etc. And the economy gets moving again. You don't need to throw a lot of money at it to make that happen. Yet we did. We did throw a great deal of money at the economy. What happened, as you can see, the buff orange-coloured line is what happens to the money supply, excluding central banks, and the blue line is the full Monty, including, and you can see that there was a huge increase between the start of the pandemic and the end of 2021. The money supply increased by 16%. Over that period of time, output increased by 4%. So there is a lot. There is the monetary overhang for you, with implicitly about 12%, as it were, of that money going into the rise in prices, not an increase in output. And just because I was interested, I thought I would see how big this, as it were, excess amount of money relative to nominal GDP was. And I think that chart is fairly impressive. This is a number which has tended to grow slowly over time. It's a bit cyclical. It goes up in booms and down in recessions. But this is the biggest up you have ever seen. And it's happened because the amount of quantitative easing that was provided in the previous recession was about 200 billion. And in this, not a recession really, we threw 450 billion into the pot. And that is the result that you can see. We come now to the role of the Bank of England in all of this. And one of the things that Tim Congdon rightly complains about is that they pay little or no attention to the money supply. Now, my perspective on this is, and it's really shown in the charts, you can see in sort of fairly rough and ready sort of way, between 1971 and 1991, the ups and downs of monetary growth were fairly well followed by changes in the growth of nominal GDP. But then we enter the Great Moderation in 1993, where inflation is basically pretty flat until we get to the most recent period. Output is pretty flat. Nominal GDP is pretty flat. But there is a big increase in the money supply in the early years of this century, and it apparently had no effect on the bank. So it had no effect on the growth of nominal GDP. Now, in my experience, economic models are usually built on, 20 or at best 30 years of data. That takes you back to the start of the Great Moderation. So if you were trying to do some econometrics on the money supply over that period, you would really not find any effect. And I think that's one of the reasons why the bank has tended to downplay, in fact, ignore really the effect of the money supply. The only thing they find in this extraordinary period of moderation is expectations play a big role, and people expect inflation to be about 2% because that's the target, and that's what it turns out to be. Well, that model has worked fairly well for 30 years, but it ain't working now, fairly obviously. And that's why we should worry, obviously. But I have to explain why it is that in that period of great monetary growth, you don't have much increase in nominal GDP or much inflation. While we're on the subject of the bank, and you'll have seen from the introduction that I'm a moderately old person, because I was an active forecaster in the 70s. No one in the Bank of England is so old by quite a long way. Even the governor, was not. He was probably barely working at this time, and most of the staff, the younger staff who run the models, this was all before they were born or when they were toddlers. So, at the human level, there is no folk memory of the 70s in the bank, and at the technical level, there's no econometric evidence that money matters. So, in the bank's world, it doesn't. And that is a great shame, because actually it does, as we'll see. But having pointed out that rapid monetary growth, which didn't cause inflation, I need to explain a bit why that might have happened, and why did we have what is often called the Great Moderation? And there are many reasons. We had inflation targeting adopted in this country in 1993. The Bank of England was given independence 4 years later, the first action of Gordon Brown as Chancellor, a very good action. The Bank of Japan was given independence a year later. And then we had the Bundesbank, which has always been a wonderful fighter against inflation, because the Germans remember what happened in the 20s. That ethos was carried over to the whole of the Eurozone in 1999, when the European Central Bank replaced 11 countries which previously had interest rates under political control. So low inflation became established. It then got built into expectations. It became actually much easier as well. And then there are the other two stories that I've heard, I've seen written, that Western markets were flooded with cheap Chinese manufactured goods, and there was free move to people under the EU law, which guaranteed a supply of low-wage migrants into the UK. Well, I thought I'd look at those two things, and here is the China situation. You can see, I think, actually, that the rise in imports from China as a share of total UK imports does roughly coincide with the beginning of the period of low inflation, although I wasn't sure it would show up in an econometric equation. But I mean, I think it does. I think there is something in that story. I think there's more in the story about immigration, again, because I think you see the rise in immigration from around 300,000 all the way up to 600,000. It does fairly clearly start around about 1991 or 2, which is, when the Great Moderation started. And another piece of evidence is that actually because, well, was it because of COVID or was it because of Brexit? We don't yet know. A lot of people went home or stopped coming, and you can see that dramatic decline in the immigration number, the orange line, just in following the pandemic. And what you've also seen is quite a dramatic breakout, you might call it, of wages, although again, this is a very volatile series and nothing yet is certain. So strong downward pressure on wages, perhaps, until now, is what those figures are telling us. So let me summarize the story so far. The government responded to the COVID crisis by locking people up in their homes, and then because they couldn't work, gave them some money. That was correct, but they funded that very generous provision which created a huge deficit, 15% of GDP, by QE, and that in my book was incorrect. It was that created the large monetary overhang, the effect of which has been delayed by a year at least because of the you couldn't spend, while you couldn't earn, you couldn't spend either in 2020. The end of the lockdown caused a fall in the savings ratio, and as a result, the monetary overhang is starting to be spent. And underlying all of this, I think, is the really important problem that this recession, so-called recession in 2020, wasn't like any other that we've ever seen. It created no spare capacity. So throwing all that money at the economy, in some sense, was bound to be inflationary. But before you get too cross, if you're English, with the British government for making that silly mistake, it has to be said they were in practically global company, and that's what the next section of my story is all about. Because, of course, the 1970s was essentially a global inflation crisis, and I think we're entering another essentially global inflation crisis. So here are some numbers, which, can I move that? If I'm clever, I can. Excuse me, I just had to move the picture of myself off the numbers that I wanted to talk about. Right, so we have, I've shown 4 medium-sized European economies, US and Canada and Japan, and I think you'll by now have looked at those numbers and seen the story, which is that inflation targets were 2% per annum in all of those countries, and in most of those countries, apart from Japan, we were looking at inflation of around 6%. These are OECD numbers, so not quite as up to date as the ones I've just shown you for the UK. Very strikingly, the money supply growth was 17%, 17.2% in the Eurozone, 17% in Canada, 36.5% in the United States, 18% here. And that was, I think not unconnected with the very large government deficits you could also see. Previously, government deficits in 2019 were around 0, 1 or 2%, and they've shot up into double digits everywhere except Germany. And the result has been palpably that inflation has shot up. And the worst offender, by quite a long way, is the United States. The worst, the biggest federal deficit, the biggest increase in the money supply, and I think close to the biggest increase in inflation. So it is a global problem we're looking at. And lessons from the 1970s, well, this is what the 1970s looked like in terms of inflation. And I've just simply drawn the inflation numbers, consumer price inflation from the OECD, for those 7 countries plus Australia. And the question now really is, what are the similarities and differences between now and then. So to what extent are we in a world which resembles the world which created that great inflation of the 1970s, or to what extent are we in a world which is so different that we don't really need to worry? And I'm going to say this twice. I'm summarizing briefly. Basically, the similarities are a large US government deficit. It is the hegemon still, I think, in many ways, and it's very important what goes on there. And they have had a huge deficit. The more interesting similarity, I think, is the point about global policy areas, on which I will spend quite a bit of time, because I don't think anyone really remembers this in the modern generation of policymakers, and it's very important. And then the third obvious similarity we all remember, in fact, the folk memory of the 1970s, it was caused by the oil price shocks. Well, it wasn't actually, but they did play an important role. And we've got energy prices rising now, and people are worried about that with some reason, I think. But there are some important differences, and I think these all point to the fact that as you can see there, in the 1970s, inflation peaked at close to 25%, and I'm not saying we're going to have anything like that because of these differences. And the differences are, first of all, in the 1970s, there was chaos because of the breakdown of Bretton Woods. I mean, policymakers really didn't know what to do. They had to learn what to do all over again. And all these years later, we've learned how to live with floating exchange rates. We know that we've got to do other things to make sure that we keep our prices stable. We have, in the words of the jargon, we have all got good nominal anchors these days. So we don't have a breakdown of Bretton Woods equivalent. We do have, I think, inflation expectations pretty well anchored because we've had a long history of low inflation. I think more important still, we do still have, they may have messed up a bit, but we still have independent central bankers who are committed to getting inflation down to target and will adjust interest. They will do the necessary with interest rates. They won't, as politicians might sometimes do, know what should be done, but decide not to because there is an election coming. And finally, actually, we've talked about the energy crisis, but I think there's less in that than there was in those days. So I'll make those points again with the data. So here's the first point about the US federal deficit. One of the sort of conventional accepted wisdom back in the day when I was a forecaster, what all went wrong. What all went wrong was that the US was fighting, as we all, I think, know, the Vietnam War. It was Kennedy's war, and then Johnson took over. And a lot of people thought he might stop the war in order to fund his real passion, which was the Great Society, i.e. a big increase in social security spending. Well, he didn't. He went on with the war and went on with the Great Society. And the result was what we thought then. I'm asking you, please focus on the left side of the chart, where you'll see that the federal deficit, which had been sort of zero in 1965, went up to what then seemed the astronomical level of 5% of GDP. And inflation went up. The growth of the money supply went up. Now look at the right-hand side of the chart, and it dwarfs anything that happened in the 70s. It dwarfs it twice. So in 2010, we had this huge increase in the federal deficit. Well, on the whole, I'm inclined to say that was pretty good. That was fighting the end of the banking crisis, recession, and it didn't lead to any great damage. This is the US inflation rate, by the way. And then we've had COVID, and as in the UK, the deficit's gone up to, in this case, 14%. So I think this is a definite parallel, because if you like, the cause the accepted cause in the 70s looks to be operating again, and possibly on a greater scale. Next chart. Now this is the difficult chart. I hope I can explain it because it won't be obvious to you at all what it's got to do with what I'm saying. So what I'm showing you here is the average rate of growth of OECD real GDP in different periods. And in what the French have come to call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years from 1945 to, I think, possibly up to 1975, there was, there were economic miracles all over Europe. They were growing at 5% per annum. And they were doing for a very good reason, because they had to rebuild war-shattered economies. We didn't do quite so well, but we grew faster than we have lately. But if you think about it, rebuilding, reconstruction is not something that goes on forever. It's a sort of one-off. And there will come a moment when the reconstruction sort of puts less in and you get slower growth. And nobody knew when that was going to happen. And as it turns out, it happened round about the late 60s, early 70s, that the rate of growth subsided from about 5% to about 3%. But nobody knew. So policymakers were all basing their design of policy on the idea that the French economy would grow at 5%, the German economy would grow at 5%, the Japanese economy would grow at 7%. And when it sort of wasn't quite getting there, they pumped more stimulus in. And the result was the Great Infla. This, for me, was the most important single reason why we had the Great Inflation, is policymakers around the world overestimated the amount of capacity that they had. Excuse me. And I think you've seen where I'm going with this. We have a similar problem with COVID, because the recession didn't actually generate any spare capacity, or only a tiny amount. Policymakers thought you needed a stimulus to get back up to where you were. You didn't. Just letting people out of their houses would do enough. And so we've had this massive monetary expansion, which wasn't needed, where there isn't output response possible on anything like the scale, and so we're getting inflation. The third similarity is the oil price, and there we have at the bottom of the bottom left of the picture, you see something which says this is just as bad, because it actually, if you look at the fuel and light component of the RPI, I have to use the RPI because the CPI doesn't go back that far. It's pretty similar. It's grown over the year from December 2020 to December 2021. It's grown by 23%, and over a similar period back in the day, January 73 to January 74, it grew by 24.9%. But here's a clue. The weight of that in the index has come down from 5.3 to 3.3. So there's a sense in which that big increase matters less for general inflation. And I should say that if you look at what's happened to oil, I did dig into these numbers, and I was really quite astonished at the extent to which the value of oil consumption relative to GDP has fallen. It's a mixture of us being cleverer at using it, and actually the rise in the price not being as big as you might think relative to the rise in GDP, etc., etc. Anyway, it's all down to, it's about a third of what it was. So there is a story here. I think oil and gas is contributing to inflation, but it's nothing like as important as it was in the 70s, which is probably good news. Otherwise, we would have an even worse situation. Now, floating exchange rates, again, this is another difficult one. I've sort of said that a lot of people didn't get it right. And so here is a chart which produces some data to support that assertion. So basically, if you look at the top panel, the numbers, you will see that if you look at the two blue countries with independent central banks, by the way, Germany and the US, their broad money stock grew at a pretty rapid 10.8 or 11.5%. Consumer price inflation was, well, pretty bad, 7.1 or 5.5%. But then look at the other countries that didn't even control their money supply that amount. UK, Japan, France, Italy up to 20% increase per annum over that period. France 15, France, Japan and us all up at about 15. And you see the consequences of inflation in strong double digits, well over 10% in the UK and Italy. So that's, if you like, is the price of getting it wrong. And that if you go back to the chart of inflation, which I will go bravely try to do now because it's quite important. If you home in on those numbers around about 75, you can see the yellow line, which is Germany, and you can see the buff line, which is the UK, and the dark line is Spain, and the pale blue line, which is Italy. You had some countries with 25% inflation and some countries with only 5% inflation. And that was all because policymakers around the world reacted differently. And basically the Americans, the Germans were quicker to realize that they had to control the money supply. They had to replace the nominal anchor that had been the exchange rate with some form of monetary targeting. So, as I say, I don't think we're in that world anymore. I think we all have recognized the need for nominal targets. We all have independent central banks. We have inflation targets. That will count for something. It will help us, I think, to get better more quickly than we did. Okay. I think I've got about 5 minutes left, and I've just got time to answer the question I posed, which is, how big, how bad is this inflation going to be? And let's focus straight in on the bigger bottom panel. So what have I done? I've done a very simple regression in percentage changes, and I've talked about I've said there's the output back could be a part of the problem, the public deficit could be part of the problem, broad money could be part of the problem, oil price could be part of the problem, and how big was the respective contribution of each of those things, and indeed, is there a significant statistical effect? Well, the answer is, if you look at the t-stats and indeed the p-values, yes, these are all significant. So the one thing that isn't significant is the intercept, which is nice, but we have a significant values. Second thing to note about these variables are all lagged, and remember, this is annual data from the 60s right up to 2020, and I found that there were basically the best fit was found with a 2-year lag on output gap and the public deficit, 3-year lag on the money supply. This is Milton Friedman long and variable lags. And look at the inflation targeting dummy. I mean, that shows, again, it's very significant, and it shows a number which is minus 3.01. And what's that saying is that the move to, proper inflation targeting with independent central banks reduced the average inflation rate by 3% per annum. So I mean, those seem to be quite persuasive stories, and looking at the statistics, the R-squared for in the days when I was a macro forecaster, we wouldn't look at anything less than sort of 0.99, but we were fooling ourselves. We had lag-dependent variables in the equations, and I think the modern move in econometrics has been towards looking at variables which are stationary, as they're called, and certainly a percentage change is. So it's not a bad R-squared for a reputable equation of this sort, and the standard error tells you that okay, you must believe everything I say to within about 3%. So it's pretty broad brush, but I still think interesting and worth looking at. And by the way, I couldn't find any effect of Chinese imports. I found a very weak effect, really not statistically significant for immigration, which I think the latter definitely surprised me. But there it is. That's what the econometric says. Here is how well the equation fits, which I think is, not bad, but do remember that the average error is 2.8%. And here in the little box in yellow to the bottom right is my answer to the question I've set myself. The lessons from the 1970s. So you had to go back to the 70s to find an effect of money supply, and actually much effect of public borrowing and all the other things. So it's definitely a lesson from the 70s. And it says inflation this year could be 9.85%, plus or minus 2.8. Well, that strikes me as being pretty much in line with what's going on. And what is, I think, the very big difference between me and most commentators is that my equation says, and I believe, because I do believe in these long lags, the next year's 2023 is probably going to be worse. And so I think most people think that, we've got all these difficult things coming out of the index, gas prices stabilize, waste prices stabilize, the inflation will go away. Well, I don't think so. We put a massive injection of demand into the system when it didn't need it. It's still feeding through. It's the main reason we are where we are, and it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop anytime soon. There is the dramatic forecast. And I was just going to conclude by repeating essentially what my story is, which is everyone thinks the inflationary surge is supply side. I'm saying no, it's demand side, which is really important. And the policy error was to pay for COVID, to pay for the response to COVID, to pay for furlough. Not bad to pay for it, but very bad not to fund the paying for it. They should have sold gilts, or they should have raised taxes. It's widespread across the West, where it's just like the global policy error in the 1970s, where everyone overestimated the amount of productive potential growth they could have. And the result was a global inflation problem. And global inflation problems are quite difficult to solve because, you're importing inflation from everybody else as well as generating your own.
So thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you on board, and I'm looking forward to the next time, perhaps in person in Buckingham or in London. Thank you very much, Bill.
Pleasure.
And for all our viewers from home, thank you very much for following us. There will be 2 more webinars in the spring term. You will find all the information on our website. Thank you very much.